if we have a block of code that we need to reuse over and over again, we can group that code into functions, and that way it will be more easier for us to reuse it and it will be more cleaner code. Here what we see is a function. So we type void, the name of the function, open and close parentheses, and then open and close curly brackets. So let's do that. So here I'm going to type void. The name of the function is going to be print. So print something, open close parentheses, open close curly brackets. What we put between these curly brackets, so what we put here will be executed when we call this function. In the previous video, we saw that we use debug.log to print something in the console, or to be more precise, to print the mathematical operations that we have performed on our variables. So here I'm going to type debug.log, so debug.log, and here I'm going to type printed from function. And this right here will be executed when we call this print something function. In order to call this function, we are simply going to call its name. So the name of the function is print something, open close parentheses, and end the statement with semicolon. This will call this function right here. It will go here. So when we run the game, it will go in the start function. It will go inside of this print something function and execute everything what it finds right here. So let's test it out. If I go back in my Unity editor, here I still have the game object from the previous video and my script is attached on it. If I run the game, we are going to see printed from function is being called or executed. So this is a function right here. Now, which brings me to these functions. This is a function, this start function is a function from this mono behavior, which we will take a look at a little bit closer in a couple of next videos and see what this mono behavior is. But this start function is a function of this mono behavior class, and it will be called right away when we run our game. Of course, we have more functions from this mono behavior. We have the awake function, and with awake with capital A, so this one right here, this function is the first function that's going to be called when we run the game. After that, our start function will be called. So even if we take this print something and put it here in this awake function, and if I go back in the Unity editor, I'm going to clear the console, run the game, we are going to see printed from function right here in the console. Because this awake function is the first one that's going to be called. And we can test this. Just to make my point, I'm going to type debug.log, and here I'm going to type printed from awake, all capitals, and I'm going to copy this and put it here in the start, and this one is going to be printed from start, in order to see from which function is called. And I know I misspelled all of these here, which is not important, but we know awake and start is right here, so we will see which one is first called. So when I run the game, when I hit play, we see here printed from awake, and after that printed from start is being called, which means that our awake function is being called first. After that, we are going to call our start function. Going back to our topic, which is functions, we have a couple of functions that we want to introduce. To be precise, we have 4 functions. This is not something that is in programming. I just invented that. So 4 types of functions, and this is better for me so that I can explain which type of functions we have. So you can think of it that we have 4. And the first type of function is this one right here. This function takes no arguments and it does not return any value. We have a function that takes arguments and does not return a value. And we also have a function that does not return a value, or returns a value but does not take arguments, and a function that returns a value and also takes arguments. Let's dive into it and see it. So this one right here does not take an argument, or it does not also return a value. Let's create a function that will take an argument. So here I'm going to type void print something to, or here I'm going to type print argument. So print argument, so that we can differentiate between these functions. If we want to add an argument, which can be a string, a boolean, a double, a float, any of our variables that we have, we add them right here in these parentheses. So here I can add a string and I can name it message. The name message is the name of this parameter. And here, instead of using debug.log and adding our own string, we can simply type here debug.log, and we can pass this message, which is this one right here. We don't need to type printed from function or so on and so forth. We can simply type out or pass this message, which is an argument. Now, when we call this function, we don't simply type print argument like this. We also need to pass or add this parameter that is asking from us, which is a string. So now here I can type, this is a function that takes an argument. An argument or a parameter. This right here is called function argument or function parameter. So we can simply pass our string like this, or we can create here string s is equal to, and we can take all of this right here and create our string, and then we can pass our string like this right here. So there is no difference. You can choose if you first want to create that string and pass it, or if you simply want to type it out like this. It's up to you. If I go back and run this now, so if I run it, we are going to see this is a function that takes an argument. And to prove my point that, or what I mentioned in the beginning, if we have a function or block of code that we want to reuse over and over again, here I'm going to call the same function print argument, but here I'm going to pass something else. Simply going to type something else. And we are going to see both of these printed in the console. So if I go back, run the game, we are going to see this is a function that takes an argument and something else printed in the console, which means that we can reuse these functions. We can call them whenever we need them to. Now, here we are simply passing this string message. We can also pass other parameters, for example, integers, and we can calculate them. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another function that's going to return a value. That value that's going to be returned is also a variable. So it can either be a string, a float, a boolean, a double, so on and so forth. Let's say I want to return an integer. Here I'm going to type int, so instead of void, we are going to type int. And here I'm going to type return the value, which is the name of our function. In the function that returns a value, we need to add a return statement. And it's like this, return, and for example, 2. It will return number 2. Let me just explain the difference between the function that returns and does not return a value. A function that does not return a value has this void type here. So void indicates that this function will not return a value. If a function returns a value, we need to type which value it returns, or the type of that value. Is it an integer, a boolean, a string, a float, a double? So we need to type that. In our case, this function returns an integer. So we can return here 2. And I can go here in our start function, and I can call our print argument, and I can simply type the value returned is, and I can type here plus to concatenate, and here I can type return the value, which is our function. Now, when our function returns a value, in this case an integer, we can type like this. We can say int a is equal to return the value, and it will return an integer, and now we have that integer saved here in this variable called a. We can also call this function right here, and it will return a value, which is an integer, and it will concatenate that integer with a string. So if I go back and run this now, so if I run the game, we're going to see the value returned, is 2. We can return any number that we want, but the main point is that we actually return a value. Now this is just a rough example of a function that returns a value. Let's take another example where we will actually see or understand this in more depth. So here I'm also going to return an integer, and I'm going to name this one calculate two numbers. And this function is going to take two parameters. So we are not limited only by one parameter. We can add 2, 10, 20, how many we want, that is up to us. So here I'm going to provide int a, and if I want to provide one more, I type comma, int b. If I want to add more, comma, int c, comma, int d or f, so on and so forth. How many parameters I want, but I just need to add comma. And we are not limited to one type of parameter. So here I'm adding integers. We are not limited only to integers. I can say here comma and pass a string, I don't know, e. I can say comma, pass a boolean r. I can say comma, pass a double ee, so on and so forth. Any type of parameter, how many I wish to add, I can do that. There is no limit to that. It only depends what you want to do. So for example, this function is called calculate two numbers. We have two integers and we need to return an integer. We can either do this, we can create int c is equal to a plus b, and then we can type return c, or we can directly return a plus b. So we can say return a plus b and remove this above. So anything or either of these two, what you want to use, you can use it. You can create an integer, then return it, or you can directly return these two arguments. And if I go back here, and I'm simply going to use debug.log, and here I'm going to type the numbers, or the value of the numbers. The value of the numbers is, and here I can say plus, and I can type calculate two numbers, and let's say for example 3 and 6. And when we call this function, so when we call the function that has multiple arguments, we also separate them by comma. So we see 3, then comma, then 6. The same way as we added those arguments. So int a, which is the name of the argument, comma, int b, comma, int c, so on and so forth. If I go in my Unity editor and run the game now, we are going to see the value of the numbers is 9. Of course, we can change these numbers. Instead of 3 and 6, I can say 32 and 66. If I go back now and run the game, we are going to see the value of the numbers is 98. And of course, we can reuse this function. So here I can type, I don't know, 1 and 6, and then I can again type here, for example, 2 and 3, and every time it will print the value of these given numbers, meaning that we are reusing the functions over and over again. So briefly, these are the 4 types of functions that we are going to use in our game development. So we have a function that takes no parameters, so we did not add any parameters right here, and it does not return a value. Void means that from here we will not return anything. And any code that we put here, of course, we are simply adding these debug.log statements. But when we create or begin creating our game, we are going to create a function that's going to animate the player, the function that's going to move the player, make him jump, and all of that code we are going to put inside of those functions, which we will see. So don't worry. Again, I'm repeating, this is just a brief introduction of this specific topic, And when we start creating our games, we are going to use this over and over and over again, and we are going to understand everything in depth what we are doing. So don't worry if everything is not crystal clear at the moment. It will be when we start creating our games. Trust me on that one. So again, we have a function that does not return a value, which is indicated by void right here. It does not take any argument, and we are simply printing out to the console. This function takes one argument, which is a string, and it can be any type of variable. A double, a float, a boolean, an integer, a string, any type of variable that we want. And we can reuse this message right here in our debug.log. So instead of printing this static function, so every time we call this print function or print something, it will print what we add here. But when we call this print argument, it will print what we provide right here. So we can control what is printed. In this function, we cannot control except if we change it right here. And if we call this function 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000 times, it will be, or printed from function will be printed in our console. But if we call this function 10 times and provide a different string, all of those different strings will be printed. Here we have a function that will return a value. This is just a rough example, and it will return an integer, and we are simply returning 2. The function that returns a value needs to have this return statement. That means return the value 2 from this function. Think of it, you have a friend and, I don't know, you gave him $5 and he returns $2 to you. So this is that return statement. It needs to return something, give it back. And we can even capture these values inside of our variables. So here it returns an integer, so we can type here int a is equal to, and we can type return the value, and this is perfectly legit, and it will return the value 2, put it in integer a, and we can reuse that value. And lastly, we have a function that returns a value, and it also takes arguments. Of course, the value that's being returned, it can be a float, an integer, a boolean, a double, any variable. It does not have to be an integer, but this is just for an example. And also here, we don't need to only add integers as parameters. We can add strings, booleans, doubles, anything that we want. And here we are simply returning a plus b. It can be a minus b, a multiplied by b, divided by b, so on and so forth. So these are the 4 types of functions that we are going to use. Again, we group a block of code that we want to reuse inside of these functions. And again, don't worry, we will see all of these functions again multiple times. Every time we create in every game, we are going to see thousands of these functions. So don't worry, we are going to explain this. If it's not crystal clear at the moment, it will be. So don't worry, please. And again, I'm repeating 4 types of functions that can not, or the function that will not return a value and does not take an argument, a function that will not return a value but does take an argument, which we can reuse inside of the function, a function that will return a value, and we are simply returning a rough value, and here we can control which value is being returned. So we can pass any 2 numbers. The same as with these 2 functions. If we call this function 10 times, it will return 2 10 times. But if we call this function 10 times and provide 10 different numbers, it will return those 10 different numbers. So in short, this was about functions.